Hello and welcome to the Peace Talk, this time with Alexandre Christoyannopoulos. Christoyannopoulos works at the Department of International Relations, Politics and History of the Loughborough University. He completed his academic studies at the University of Kent, covering disciplines such as economics, international relations, and European studies. And he completed his PhD in politics and government and included theology and religious studies. He worked both for the University of Kent and Canterbury Christchurch University prior to joining Loughborough in 2010. His research and teaching interests include pacifism and nonviolence, especially Anarcho-Pacifism, political theory, critical security, and critical terrorism studies. Dear Alex, I thank you very much for taking the time.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So before we move on to your book, which impressed me, Christian Anarchism, a political commentary on the gospel, published in 2010, before we go deeper into your work, let's talk about your journey, your academic journey. What did motivate you to study, and did you have any academic role models?
It's always a question I'm not too sure how to answer, the kind of personal trajectory, because it's a little bit too kind of transparent, I suppose. Look, I enjoyed studying at university, BA, MA. I had to then confront the decision of what I wanted to do, and I'd never really found something I wanted to do in the private sector for various reasons, including kind of moral ones. What it's dedicated to didn't make me thrilled. I toyed with public service, and I actually did an internship, and I found it frustrating. And I suppose I had the chance to have, a family and a sort of socioeconomic position that made the PhD a possibility. And I found it quite attractive. So I drifted into that. I kind of liked the idea of sort of teaching and researching. And one thing led to the next. I could pretend if it was a job interview that all of this was kind of planned, but it kind of happened gradually. And I eased myself into a job, which isn't easy and involves a bit of luck to get into academia. I mean, as well as, work, and I got lucky enough, I suppose. So that's in terms of trajectory. I mean, why anarchism, religion? I'd always been interested in questions of justice, injustice, suffering, violence, non-violence, pacifism. When is violence legitimate? Why is this violence legitimate, not that one? And I suppose at the time, this was 2001 when I finished my MA, religion was widely talked about in politics, especially with a focus on Islamism, of course, or whatever you want to call it. But it became quite clear the moment you just dug a little bit deeper that there's plenty more to look at. And the PhD was going to look at that originally, and eventually it has to sort of zoom in on something. And one way or another, I ended up, I suppose, first provoked in a good way by Tolstoy's political thought that I found really interesting and kind of, inspiring and thought-provoking. And the PhD was going to be on that. And then for various reasons, including that Tolstoy leaves a few gaps and kind of ignores things in ways that I think are weakening the Christian anarchist argument, I then kind of picked up some of the other stuff, Werner Deller, Jacques, Ellul, and others, and thought, okay, well, I'll put them together, and that will be the PhD. And so that's how I ended up with that. And I mean, since then, I suppose it's been a story of, I don't know, is it zooming out? I've gone back to Tolstoy. I've written a fair bit on him, on religion and anarchism in general. And these days, it's more about anarcho-pacifism, not necessarily religious, which I'm interested in. Back to the broader questions of political violence, especially. I'm kind of dropping the religion a little bit in my immediate research at the moment, but obviously I remain interested in it. As for role models, it's hard to say. I think my eyes were opened when I eventually landed in modules that were taught where the established professors were kind of openly critical about the system that we're in, not in an anarchist way, not that radical, but still saying things that I thought were, not acceptable according to the orthodoxy. And I thought, okay, great. So you can get a job and do that, and you know, and there's plenty to look at. And so I suppose that inspired me in some sense. So yeah, that's as good an answer I can give you, I think. I hope that kind of yeah, satisfies your curiosity.
Well, nice. Yeah, you are fortunate and lucky to do so. We are discussing in a reading circle, and then also I visit a philosophy seminar where we read Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, Marx, bell hooks, Kimberly Crenshaw, and then we read some critical theories and so on and so forth, but then we realize that, okay, but how can we apply such theories in the real world? How can we find a job? And yeah, that's one thing that
on that, just so at Loughborough, we've organized a number of conferences on anarchist studies, and this kind of predates me to some extent, although I've been here for a while, and it's interesting to see how many people come from all over Europe and beyond, from all sorts of different disciplines, from whatever, media studies, sociology, anthropology, politics, you name it. And there are quite a few institutions that will happily employ people whose outlook is quite critical or radical. Not all of them, right? Let's be clear. I think the I don't know about the trick, but the thing to still ensure you do if you want to get in is to play by some of their rules. So there are a number of things that they want to see published in terms of quality markers and whatever. And as long as you do that, and you know, and it's not cheating, you do it. Yeah, it involves work, but then you have a chance. And after that, it's about how competitive the job market is and whether you can get lucky that, you know, the right kind of job becomes available and the people there want the kind of profile that you have. And it's you know, it's not something that's open to everyone, but I think these things are possible. It's just, yeah, it's not easy, especially in the UK, I think, especially when you come from a sort of political theory background, which I suppose I was marketing myself as at the time. But yeah, sorry, I digress.
No, it's very interesting. And in my I was looking it up, and I believe anarchism is only taught in 2 or 3 institutions, and only I believe so. Loughborough is the Mecca to be in to frame it in a theological word. Yeah, it's the Mecca of anarchism, so to speak.
The Mecca is a good one. I mean, a good former colleague of ours, a comrade, one who actually has not been lucky by that system, nevertheless, but whose work I deeply respect, once described Loughborough as the beating heart of anarchist studies globally, which I suppose I prefer to the Mecca. Although I don't know, you can go with Mecca if you want. Yeah, there are other places where there's you know, more than one sort of scholar working on anarchism from one angle or another, but Loughborough has had 3 at the moment, quite a few PhD students as well, and yeah, there's at least there's one module on it, and I suppose it creeps up here or there. It's not necessarily what students come to study, but it's a perspective that you can apply to what we do study.
Yeah, and it's I see it as there is a lack of such critical radical theory and approaches and perspectives in academia as such, because we read Marx, yes, we read feminist theory a lot here in Vienna especially, but no anarchist citation, book, article, Bakunin. I've never heard in one seminar or lecture the name of Proudhon, Bakunin, Kropotkin. No, there is no such thing. So yeah, Marxism is more dominant in academia.
No, that's a fair point, but I think there are still plenty of critical voices that are allowed and read, etc. Anarchism is, I think it's making headway, but it remains a marginal perspective, and there's still plenty of research to be done and published in order to make it relevant to people too. I think it's happening. The last 10-20 years have been quite fruitful, but yeah, there's plenty that remains to be done, and to bring it to the attention of scholars who should be interested in this, and teachers, but who aren't registering it on their radar for whatever reason. Yeah.
And there was this book, Anarchist Turn. I don't remember the name of the author, in Pluto Press. the anarchists, Blumenfeld, Jacques, and Simon Critchley were one of the authors. And yeah, so there is more and more attention to these fields, and yeah, absolutely, yeah. And
if if you're someone who's interested in it, plenty of good research projects can be made with an anarchism, the ingredient of anarchism as part of the project, and then it's about approaching an institution or offering to work for an institution that's not allergic to the word, and after that, as long as you tick their boxes, there's room for it. And more from a different angle, we need this outlook, we need this perspective, we need to think more radically about what's going on today, because we're heading for a precipice, and in fact we're hitting a wall, and we keep hitting it even harder, as if it's going to get us any better.
Yeah, the climate crisis is
that's the main that. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you, and I see there's such a... Let's jump right into your book, Christian Anarchism. It is a book which can be categorized in the same category as the book of Jacques Ellul, Anarchy and Christianity, or Mark van Steenwyk, The Holy Anarchist, Reflection on Christianity and Anarchism, or Dave Andrews, Michael Elliott, and many more. What is the name? What does that mean, Christian anarchism? Because for some of my radical colleagues and comrades, it is not a synonym, and for many, they stated no gods, no state, and no patriarchy, and so on and so forth. So how one can combine and think these two things together? And in the first sense, it doesn't make sense. But then when we go deeper and deeper, maybe it will make sense. So please, let's start from here. How can you combine these two things?
No, look, yes, I acknowledge that. And today I was tweeting, because it's only come out on Friday. The French translation of the book has come out on Friday, by the way, with the same publisher as those who originally published Jacques Ellul's book, Atelier de création libertaire. So, and I've already had some reactions in French, ni Dieu ni maître, and how can you possibly combine them? And look, I hear you. I think, right, so if to be an anarchist you must reject religion, then Christian anarchists are an impossibility. If to be an anarchist is to reject the state, is to be critical about all sorts of forms of hierarchy, and you could perhaps bracket religion aside briefly, then Christian anarchism is possible. And I must add that the Christian anarchists I have engaged with are, by the vast majority, heavily critical of churches and religious institutions. So they can be quite anti-clerical, even if they are religious, as it were. The argument there's plenty of books out there, there's plenty of angles you can take. And one thing I probably don't do well enough in the book, because it's kind of the published version of the thesis, and the thesis was called Theorizing Christian Anarchism, but I dropped the theorizing because the publisher didn't want that word in there. What the book really does is it's an exegesis. It's what the second part of the title suggests. It's trying to interpret the New Testament in particular, along with Christian anarchists, and trying to put together as coherent an exegesis as possible, according to which Christianity, in the sense of Jesus's teaching and example, amounts or should amount to or prescribes a form of anarchism. Okay, so in that rough sense, that's what I'm taking. It's not so much a definition, or maybe a definition of Christian anarchism to be. It's an argument according to which Christianity amounts or should amount to anarchism, at least exegetically speaking, in terms of interpreting the Bible, the New Testament specifically, and especially what Jesus says. So if you run with that argument, there are lots of different voices that have argued that kind of thing for the last, well, at least century and a half, if not couple of millennia, but that's a different debate. And what I try to do in the book is put these voices together, because they're some of them are not aware of one another. Again, Tolstoy is often mentioned in the academic circles, not necessarily in the activist circles. as the main one, and he's really good on all sorts of things, but he's really unhelpful on some others, where other voices such as Jacques Ellul, more often mentioned, or the Catholic worker movement people, Dorothy Day, Varna, Peter Morin, Eamon Hennessy, and numerous others. If you put them together, I think they put a coherent argument according to which, again, well, let's put it that way, a good, a true interpretation of Jesus's teaching and example cannot but imply a form of anarchism through two routes, and they're not both obvious in the book equally. So one is a kind of commitment to pacifism that brings that pacifism to the state, right? Reject violence, turning the other cheek, etc., etc. And we don't do that to one another through the state. The state doesn't do that, and so for that reason, a lot of Christian anarchists are anarchists because they become pacifists along the way. That's one main line of argument. The other is through the arguments about idolatry, that the state is a form of idolatry, which no good, true, proper Christian should adhere to. And so that's the second kind of main thrust, if you want, of arguments. Now, I later, after the book, wrote a chapter, again, that's been published in French as a book, actually, with the same publisher, but that tries to sort of, I suppose, implicitly acknowledge and be a bit fairer in terms of the literature. I try in that chapter. I was helped with some of it with a colleague in Laura App, so it's co-authored. We try and look at 4 different areas of scholarship around Christianity and anarchism. One is there's plenty of scholarship that's critical of religion from anarchism, and there's plenty to be said about that. So that's acknowledged, and we cite some such sources. But then if you become open to the possibility that there could be such a thing as religious anarchism or Christian anarchism, then there are at least 3 different ways in which there's all sorts of publications out there, or 3 different areas of scholarship or research or writing. One is anarchist exegesis, so it's the kind of stuff that I did in the book, but pulling from what others have done, Tolstoy and Ellul and others who do exactly that. In a way, I don't really do much in the book apart from bringing them together. They are voices that are out there already. Although I try and bring as many as I can together. Then there's anarchist theology, which is a different project, which is thinking, theologically about particular problems, rooted in a particular interpretation or angle, but not necessarily constantly going back to the text in a way exegesis does. And then there's plenty of research published and to be published in religious anarchist historiography, the writing of the history of these individuals and movements, from Jesus's immediate followers all the way to today. And all 3, by the way, categories aren't necessarily strictly Christian. There are examples of other religious traditions writing that kind of way of approaching that question. So yes, one of the slogans that you find some Christian anarchists like as a spin on no gods, no masters is no master but God, which is, of course, problematic for an anarchist position that's at least, I don't know, metaphysically anarchical, right? So asking the questions, bringing the criticism of hierarchy to, call it metaphysics, religion, spirituality. And that's always going to be an awkward one for fellow anarchists. If you get past that, most Christian anarchists are, again, critical of the churches and religious institutions, critical of the state, of capitalism, of ecocide, of patriarchy, and all sorts of other structures of oppression. But you have to kind of go past that, and that's not easy in some circles. And by the way, just to close on an anecdote, it's always interesting how when you talk to people about Christian anarchism, you often get them to say, no, let me rephrase. You either get a response that's perhaps curious, and you explain a bit, and they go, oh yeah, okay, I can see how you could go about arguing that, and that's interesting, and you get that kind of response often. I've had anecdotally a lot of that response is in Protestant countries, as in the Anglo-Saxon world, if that's a term, in Scandinavian countries, in Germany, elsewhere, depending where you are. If I turn up and speak to kind of someone who's French, a French anarchist, an Italian anarchist, a Spanish anarchist, I'm much more likely to get pushback, as in, what do you mean that's impossible? That's a contradiction in terms. And I understand that. It depends what you define anarchism as. But for Christian anarchists, for religious anarchism, religious anarchism isn't an oxymoron, but isn't a contradiction in terms. it's an oxymoron. It's a repetition of the same thing, right? Is that, am I getting my terms confused now? I possibly might be. It's a redundancy. It's just repeating what you're saying. You shouldn't need to say anarchist when you say Christian, if you are a proper Christian, to put it that way.
Yeah. Sounds very interesting. I encountered such a movement in Bulgaria, where we had an anarchist circle, reading circle, and we had a room. We organized many events, parties, demonstrations, and so on and so forth. And then I met Krasi, beautiful, wonderful person. And he introduced me and he said, I'm a Christian. And, but I said to him, but listen, we are anarchists. And he said, no, that I'm here in the right place. and I was smiling and wondering, but then I got to love him and I.
But that's a beautiful way of illustrating this other point, which I should have also made, which is that if you reject that even as a possibility, you close the door to potential comrades, allies. There are among even sort of anarchists who are anarchists for, call them secular reasons, but out of a logic that isn't necessarily religious. There are people who are also religious, who are also Christian, or who might be there in part because of their understanding of the religious tradition. And if you reject that even as a possibility, that's potential allies who are alienated. Let me also add this. I have found it interesting how I've been getting contacted more recently, increasingly, by people in the US especially, who are interested in the arguments in the book for Christian anarchism in general, and who are coming at it from, well, I hesitate to bring it up, but yeah, from a potentially anarcho-capitalist perspective originally. So you get the religious and you get the capital, and yet they engage with the arguments, and you see them shift away from capitalism. I don't know about the away from Christianity. And so again, if you close off that very possibility, these are people who you could convert, to put it that way, who you're alienating. And if only for that reason, I think it's good to kind of leave things open, even if that's not to say you have to accept that, that the stuff about God is acceptable. It might be problematic to you and remain so, and fine. And we don't have to agree on everything. But yeah.
And it's also from a not academic perspective, but from a personal point of view, going through life, it's very self-limiting and even destructive, because you break up with relationships, you exclude people that might be your best friend, or that are really good and honest people. So it's very self-limiting, and this instinct, this first reaction that comes, Christian, so you are not my friend. I understand it as well, but in my opinion, it's self-limiting. And
I agree. And one more thing, actually, if I may, let's remember that one of the reasons I think, no gods, no masters was such a powerful slogan at the time is that the church in particular was particularly powerful at the time. And the arguments about God were the arguments of the elite, the mainstream, the orthodoxy, that there were what was being imposed from the top down, and people were pushing back against that. It's a different context today, especially in sort of, I don't know, more secularized societies. I don't know how secularized they are. It gets complicated. We don't want to go there necessarily, but it is a different context. And therefore, we can still agree about the church if you want, with a lot of Christian anarchists, nearly all, but disagree about the metaphysics.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we have to separate and differentiate between the institutionalized church and between, for example, faith or spirituality, whatever that is. It's a subjective thing in my opinion. And there are two separate things. And spirituality without the will, so to speak, to implement it and universalize, so to speak, and to spread the word, it's okay, it's fine. You can, in my opinion, I don't know. And that's only because anarchism, for me, it is a radical change, and it's a radical movement, but it does not seek to implement it, or it does not seek to take power, to take over, it
doesn't impose it. I think it still seeks to be implemented, right? And in that sense, you can, I'm afraid, I think you can carry on with some of the religious vocabulary, because you're looking to convert people, you're looking to transform people so that they, but by example, by prefiguration, not top down. You're not imposing it, unlike what a lot of religious traditions have done, including Christianity. That bit's rejected by Christian anarchists, I think you could say. Yeah.
And the term, the concept of prefiguration is also a very, here we can draw some similarities with Christianity, because as Jesus does it, he was an egalitarian, he didn't exclude people, on the contrary, he lived and preached solidarity, even with the poor, with the excluded, and that's prefiguration. Live a life that is not there right now.
Absolutely, and prefiguration in the tough sense as well, of kind of love and forgiving. I mean, the turning of the other cheek, he prefigures all the way to his crucifixion. I mean, this is something that's quite courageous, which I'm not sure a lot of so-called Christians today adhere to. I mean, I know that's controversial what I'm saying, but that is that's the argument that comes from Christian anarchism. So no, absolutely, prefiguration, even in that most challenging aspect of Jesus's teaching for most Christians today. Look, Christianity is marked as among religions, as it were, as the one that preaches turning the other cheek, which most people find utopian, farcical, excessive. But that's the very thing that's so central and different from that particular religious teaching, or it seems to be anyway. And yet it's the bit that Christians go, no, he doesn't mean that for now. I know it's challenging. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying I'm adopting it, but he seems to be quite clear about it, and it does have political implications. And that's basically the, I suppose, the hook for the book. That's when you begin the journey of trying to reinterpret your interpretation of Christianity on the way to a Christian anarchist conclusion.
Yeah, I can totally understand you. And on Facebook, my name, I wrote it Josef Mühlbauer and GC, the shortcut, because he inspired me. The way he lived his life. And even though there is a debate that did he exist or not, I don't care. I don't care if it's a historical figure or a fiction. I don't care. The example that is given by this story, that is all what matters to me. And I believe, Well,
that's a very Tolstoyan thing to say. Tolstoy was asked at the time when he was writing. So Tolstoy writes his Christian anarchist stuff from roughly 1879 to his death in 1910, and it's the period when there's increasingly kind of scholarship asking about the historical Jesus. Did he really exist? And so on. Someone asked him, what about this scholarship? And he said, look, I mean, I'm paraphrasing from memory, but if they prove that he didn't exist, so much the better. At least we can focus on his teaching, which is the main thing that I'm interested in. That's basically what he said. So you're being very Tolstoyan.
Oh, wonderful. I didn't realize. Okay. So let me dig deeper and ask you the following question. Okay, we established that Christian anarchism does exist, and it depends on the terms and definitions. It's not a contradiction. But then we have this problematic problem of the state. Not only because the state and the church, for example, take the Brazilian example where the church is supporting the state, or take historicals, much more brutal examples, such as the Third Reich and the role of the Christian church in the Third Reich, and many others. So how a person of faith relates to the state? And maybe before we answer this question, we might go a step back and explain to the audience what is an anarchist or critical perspective of the state. Is a state a neutral sort of platform where everybody can express their desire, or is it a power relation such as Foucault mentioned it? Or what is the state, and why are anarchists critical of the state?
That's an easy one. Yeah, so I'm kidding. it's a difficult one to answer in brief, because you're going to get lots of different answers among anarchists on what the state is. What anarchists dislike about the state seems to me to be the hierarchy, the imposition of preferential treatment, let's put it that way, for some people, the coercion that's involved, or the violence that's often involved, the brutalization of people in the process. I mean, you have different flavors, and you can go Foucault, you can go Tolstoy, you can go Proudhon, there's all sorts of different lines. I think, though, I want to say this, which is that the more I read anarchists and read about anarchism, the more I find problematic the summary of anarchism as opposition to the state, as if that's the main or the only thing. And some anarchists do it too. So, and I don't want to claim that they're wrong, as it were. That's what it means to them. It seems to me that a more helpful way of approaching it, some colleagues have articulated it as opposition to domination. Anarchism is opposition to domination of all sorts of kinds: the political domination of the state, the economic domination of capitalism, the patriarchal domination of gender relations, etc., heteronormativity. You can talk about racism, you can talk about all sorts of things. And the reason that anarchists then often zoom in on the state is that the state, the Westphalian state, is often the safeguard, the protector of all these other structures of domination. It's the ultimate coercer, the police man or police person that ultimately protects those various other intersectional hierarchies too. So there are lots of problems you can have with the state. For Christian anarchists, it'll be especially around state violence and coercion on the one hand, from laws and prisons all the way to war, etc., and patriotism along the way. That's on the one hand, and on the other, it'll be the state as this thing that is treated as a savior, a bit godlike, and precisely in a way that's idolatrous and problematic from that perspective. There are other reasons why anarchists dislike the state. Now, what Christian anarchists do about the state, in the book, I try and separate out what I think are two different lines of responses in the Christian anarchist literature. There's the sort of direct response to the response to the fact the state is there, might come asking for taxes, etc. And there's the example we put out as a way of doing things differently, ignoring the state, as it were, showing that it can be done without it. So to focus on the former first, part of the challenge, of course, for Christian anarchists is the usual trump card that people feel is always going to be used. It's render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and especially Romans 13. People go, but this is where you're wrong. Your exegesis is mistaken. Well, not so obviously so. And in the book, I unpack that. There are various reasons why render unto Caesar doesn't necessarily mean obey the state, whatever it asks. I mean, the statement is give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. We often forget the second bit, and that's the bit that talks about all the stuff that's more important as far as Christian anarchists are concerned. I mean, if you want, I can go into Romans 13, but really briefly. First of all, it's Paul, it's not Jesus, worth remembering in terms of hierarchy of authority there, and it's in who you're listening to, authority in the sense of moral authority, I suppose. But more to the point, for Christian anarchists, the text needs to be looked at as Romans 12 and 13 together. The chapters weren't Paul, they were added later on. And it's a passage where Paul is telling Christians in Rome who are being persecuted in the heart of the empire, what to do about that persecution. And in effect, what he's giving them is an exegesis of turning the other cheek. He's basically saying, don't go into violent insubordination, submit to higher powers in the sense of when they're coming to you and punishing you. That's what Jesus did as well. Forgive and love as best you can. But that's not saying love the state, be fanatical about it, expect it to save you. And he still says there and elsewhere that ultimately the higher, let's call it moral authority, I'm putting those words in myself, but I think it's a legitimate interpretation, is God's, as it were. It's that moral teaching, if you prefer it that way, rather than the state. And where there is a conflict between what let's say it that way, what morality is asking you to do and what the state is asking you to do, then it's the former that's more important than the latter. So that opens the road for all sorts of acceptable forms of civil disobedience, etc. And that's, I suppose, one flank then, the kind of response to the fact of the state, the fact that it might come asking for taxes, etc., whatever else. I mean, I can unpack a bit more if you want, but then the other side is being the example of an alternative, both as an individual and as a community, of loving and caring for one another, an economy of care and mutual aid and sacrifice, potentially, you know, showing the example of the new society in the shell of the old or independent of the old, ignoring the old, right? Paraphrasing the IWW quote. And some of it will be tough. Some of it does demand sacrifices in the tough religious sense too. But the Christian anarchist understanding of Christianity is that is what Christianity calls for. Whether you take Christianity to mean, and I should say that for some Christian anarchists, Christianity, you know, does have a metaphysical element, is something that you believe in, you have faith in some sort of higher authority or whatever else. For others, like Tolstoy, it's just faith in what he sees as the rational teaching articulated by Jesus. There isn't a metaphysical component to it for him. And you do all this, you exemplify that alternative, you prefigure it individually and collectively, partly in the hope that it will inspire others, that it's a mustard seed that will grow, right, to use some of the parabolic language of the Bible. Whether it does or not is something else we can discuss, but I think there's plenty of evidence in the last century of non-violent civil disobedience, non-violent campaigns that acting in a way that is loving and forgiving and refusing to adopt violence, even in resistance against injustice, doesn't necessarily lead to you being wiped out. It might mean some concrete violence against you, your bodies, your comrades, absolutely, but you're not the one inflicting it. And in the process, sooner or later, it does seem to shift the heart of some of the people who are inflicting this upon you, if not the core of, you know, the system of oppression, at least some of the people helping it out. And the hope is therefore that you get to transform that wider society by that example that you're putting forward. So those are the two flanks, I think, of the kind of Christian anarchist response to the state. There's probably more I could say about any of this. You can tell me if you want more on any of that, but hopefully that gives you a broad overview at least.
Yeah. And like Buddha and Socrates, I read a wonderful book, Jesus, Buddha, and Socrates, and so that's why I'm referring to these three, because all three were criticized their society. All of them criticized the power structure and demanded more and more egalitarian society, and that's why they got killed. So it's impressive, but that's the radical. That's the radical example. That's not, yeah, this is not common, but and it's an ideal that is not for everybody. So it's also understandable.
Absolutely, but so you see, for example, as someone who's often articulating pacifist arguments in company that doesn't define itself as pacifist, you know, you face all sorts of questions, and people assume that the only way to defend yourself has to involve violence. They'll always push the example of self-defense, etc. Look, I have respect for people who are willing to suffer and die to help others or for a broader cause. I just think that killing in the process is something that's probably unnecessary, ineffective, morally problematic, and by the way, irreligious. There are three different arguments in terms of effectiveness, in terms of morality, and in terms of, if you go there, religious grounding. It doesn't seem to sort of be all that acceptable. And the thing about the prefiguration, the way of life, the kind of response to injustice that Christianity, I think, preaches, at least if you follow Christian anarchists, does involve difficult sacrifices, but they're not necessarily much harder than the ones we're requiring of soldiers who go out and are risking their lives as well. What makes the Christian anarchist method challenging, I think, is that in people's minds it's a kind of giving up, it's a putting yourself up for slaughter. It's in their minds unlikely to be effective. Surely you want to react. Well, it is a reaction. The Christian anarchists aren't preaching a kind of passive, I'll just let it happen. There's all sorts of ways you can react. And in the wider literature, not necessarily Christian, on non-violent civil disobedience, etc., there's hundreds, certainly dozens of different reactions that can be preached. And they might be risking things for you. They might be threatening, that you might be in danger. But they're reactions that hope to change the other person's perspective rather than impose, with a gun on their head, a different behavior which doesn't come from the inside out. It's challenging to sort of accept that it might work, but there's increasing evidence that it can work. And let me throw this in and then shut up, because you might have another question. There's a famous book now from Erika Chenoweth, Maria Stefan. There's some problems with it, but it's on the whole pretty kind of established now. It's only widely cited, published in 2011, looked at I think it's over 300 examples over a whole century, from 1900 to around 2008. Examples of violent and non-violent resistance to oppression, and kind of coding them for either success, partial success, or failure. And again, skipping some of the methodology and some of the debates there is, on the whole, their conclusion at least is that violent resistance fails just as non-violent resistance fails more often than they succeed. Both fail more often than they succeed, but violent resistance fails twice more often than non-violent resistance. And by the way, along the way, there are other things to notice, such as when non-violent resistance succeeds, the society it gives way to is one that's much more respectful of human rights, democracy, etc., than violent resistance is. And so on the argument of purely kind of effectiveness, it's not clear to me that being willing to die but also kill is any better than being willing to die but to act non-violently with just as much passion against injustice. I think Christian anarchists are among the voices in that mix. There are plenty of others, but they could point to Jesus a little while ago as an example of someone who tried to do that too.
Yeah,
he succeeded, and given what the cross became as a symbol is a different debate. The cross, by the way, was a symbol that was the punishment reserved by Rome for political subversives. It's now become a religious symbol, but it's something that was meant to be a punishment for political subversives. But anyway, I digress. I get excited. Shut up.
No, it's fine. Yeah, I get a lot of information. I love it. So you are arguing also that Jesus was a pacifist. Is that correct? Because I know the passage in the Bible where he did the temple cleansing, and he threw out you're doing business economic stuff in my temple.
Yeah.
In my father's temple, or whatever. I'm paraphrasing.
Thieving is the word. This was a house of prayer, and you turned it into a den of thieves. Thieving is the activity. It's not even, it's not a good representation of business. Look, yes, I think so. In the book, I unpack that because it's absolutely...
Maybe. Sorry to interrupt. Maybe it's the best way of defining neoliberal economics. But sorry.
Good. I like that. Look, this is central to a lot of Christian anarchists. Again, not necessarily all of them, but people like Tolstoi as well as others. Central to that Christian anarchism is the argument that basically Jesus is a form of pacifism. I mean, until relative pacifism is a term coined in 1901. Before that, the people in those currents of Christianity would talk more about non-resistance, which is also somewhat of a misnomer because it suggests kind of passivity, and it's not complete passivity. But anyway, it's quite clear that Jesus keeps banging on about not resisting violence. He just does it again and again, talks about forgiving, talks about loving your neighbor, even your enemies. I mean, that's fairly consistent. But then, yes, people sometimes then say, but he overthrew the tables and he had a whip and he used violence. I mean, again, in the book, I unpack this because Christian anarchist writers that I pull into the book. There is of the four gospels, only one talks of a whip, and it's the only one that talks of the cattle and the sheep. It's a way of getting them out. Yes, Jesus is upset. Yes, he overturns the tables, we can talk about violence against property if you will, but there's no evidence that he's actually punching anyone. There's no violence, physical violence against other human beings. And so I think what that allows me to do in the book is to argue that the kind of spectrum of acceptable action from a Christian perspective in response to injustice ranges from anything at the sort of at one end that looks like turning the other cheek, giving the cloak when the coat's being asked, you know, going that extra mile, which isn't passive, but it's a very sort of it's a response that accepts the violence upon yourself. That's at one end, all the way to overturning the tables and that kind of more direct, non-violent civil disobedience, I think, and naming things as thieving, is that if that's what you think they are. And so I think, yeah, and there are very few passages in the New Testament where you can argue that what is being preached is violent. I again mentioned the 2 or 3 others, but they're really, I mean, they're minor and the argument doesn't work very well, especially when so much of the overwhelming argument that of what comes from Jesus's mouth, as relayed in what survived of his teaching, by the way, the bits that are codified 300 years later by the top-down church, the bits they couldn't erase almost, you know, even that is kind of pretty consistently putting forward a point of view that seems like a form of pacifism to me, and one that has to lead to a questioning of state violence. That's the Christian anarchist argument. That's one of the core arguments anyway.
Yeah. I met some Christian guys who go to church every Sunday, and in my opinion, they didn't I don't want to sound arrogant.
Well,
okay.
Let's give the caveat. Go ahead.
No, my point was a different one. So where do you draw the line? Because, for example, in morality and especially when we take a philosophical approach, where do you draw the line of non-violence? Because being a human is per definition some sort of violent, and you have to act sometimes violently, especially against plants, if you have to eat something. Maybe one can argue then if you draw the line very far, very radical, then you don't have to, you are not allowed to eat meat because you are killing animals. I had a wonderful and debate with a militant vegan, and yeah, it's debatable. And absolutely, where do you draw the line?
Well, I think you draw the line where you define violence, and that's something that differs from one person to the next. I don't want to necessarily say where where I think you and everyone else should draw it. I think I'll just acknowledge that I think it depends. Tolstoy, for example, was one of the early vegetarians. I mean, he draws the line to include violence against animals, which he therefore thinks needs to be foregone. Look, defining violence is another really difficult one. I think at the very least, I want to make sure that the line is drawn around physical violence against fellow human beings. That's the bit you can't go beyond if you're an advocate of non-violence, basically, I think, or it's very difficult to do so. I mean, violence against property, even burning things, if you're not killing someone, it's just not the same type of violence. There are things like structural violence, which we can talk about because it might mean human suffering as well, and that's a serious contender too. Violence against animals, absolutely. I mean, but yeah, to be alive is to some extent to rely on other life. I mean, it's very difficult to breathe without, yeah, I suppose even mosquitoes and other small living cells. You can go that far if you want, and some people do. I think for a lot of advocates of non-violence, a lot of Christian anarchists, you don't have to go that far. You can, and there are certainly quite a few people who go at least all the way to vegetarianism or veganism. Absolutely. Not all of them do. I think the bottom line for me, not the bottom line, but yeah, the core non-negotiable one is physical violence against human beings. I suppose direct or indirect, I would probably want to add, because that's probably quite important. By the way, that study that I mentioned of Chenoweth and Stefan is contentious because one of the decisions they take is, they consider a campaign non-violent when, I can't remember, fewer than 100 people have violence committed against them in the process. That's 100 too many. But again, I think just to take a step back, and before we kind of all join in and kind of flog the advocates of non-violence and punish them metaphorically, this is still much less violence than a lot of, you know, the revolutionary violence, the state violence that we see on a daily basis. So I think, yeah, it's to do with how you define violence, and that's a tricky one. I agree.
Yeah. Now you mentioned many times Tolstoy, and as I was looking up your CV, you published a lot about Lew Tolstoi.
Yeah.
Before, now I'm a little bit polemic, before the West entirely burns all the books of this Russian thinker, let's talk about Lew Tolstoy before we never will saw.
We can talk about Bakunin, Kropotkin. There are plenty of other Russians that are worth listening to more than, you know, the current Vladimir in power. Look, or the church hierarchy. But anyway, no, yeah. Go on. What do you want to say?
No,
about...
I wanted to ask you, what can we learn from Tolstoy, and was he an anarchist? I mean, did the term exist at this time? I don't know.
Right, so the term did exist, and he positioned himself against it at the start, and then accepted that his teaching was similar, except on the non-violence, because he interpreted anarchism to necessarily mean kind of bomb throwing, etc. Now, let me rewind. Tolstoy is an awkward client. Tolstoy is someone, so this is the same Tolstoy that wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina. When he writes Anna Karenina, he's going through a deep existential crisis. That's how he describes it later on as well, at the end of which comes a break, and he describes it as a clean break. Some of his biographers say it's not that clean a break, but never mind. Certainly there's a break in what he writes, because after 1879 he adopts kind of wholeheartedly Jesus's ethics or moral teaching, especially the Sermon on the Mount, the turning on the other cheek, which he interprets as a form of absolutist pacifism. And so Tolstoy is, let me put it that way. Tolstoy is a pacifist, an anarchist, a weird Christian. But here's the thing, with each of these things, he's awkward. He's an awkward pacifist because, unlike most pacifists, he is an absolutist. Most pacifists aren't absolutists, like, you know, never would even protect a child, etc. Tolstoy isn't clear on that. Yeah, so he's an absolutist pacifist. He's an awkward anarchist because he derives his anarchism from Jesus's teaching, which is kind of a problem for some anarchists, as we've said before. And he's not engaged in social movements. You know, he's not a trade union kind of syndicalist type anarchist. He's writing from his posh estate, although he dresses like a peasant, eats vegetarian, makes his own shoes, tries to move in that direction by example, as it were. He's an awkward Christian because he doesn't believe in the resurrection, he doesn't believe in the miracles, he doesn't believe in church rituals. He's deeply anti-clerical, which makes him an awkward ally for Christians. So he's an awkward client on all those things. And so that's why I suppose the book's subtitle, I eventually did write the book on him, what was going to be the PhD, eventually came out as a book. It's Christian Anarcho-Pacifist Iconoclasm. And I kind of go into the sort of then and now, trying to explain what he says. I try and quote him and systematize his thought, because it's not very systematic. He writes for all sorts of different audiences, all sorts of things. And a lot of it is really interesting and thrilling, but I try to put it together and give lots of quotes. And then I try and reflect on what might be relevant from that for us today. And so he wrote, in terms of context, 1881, 2 years after he converts to this, is when Narodnaya Volya, a Russian anarchist outlet, assassinate the Tsar of Russia at the time, kicking off a bit of an anarchist wave of terrorism, which is the thing that anarchists still find themselves having to sort of dissociate themselves from in a lot of public debate, right? There's this assumption that anarchists are bomb throwers, which is, I was going to use a swear word. It's wrong, as in it's nonsense for the vast majority of anarchists. Some perhaps, and historically certainly there were them, but no. So Tolstoy wants to differentiate themselves from them. He distinguishes themselves from those anarchists. But he says when he's given I forget, there's an anarchist anthology that's published, or there's a book about anarchism, and he's mentioned as one of them, and he reads that, and after that he kind of says he agrees with everything except on the violence with anarchists. But it's worth saying, by the way, that he's as critical as he is of revolutionaries willing to use violence, whether anarchist or Marxist or others, as he is, and perhaps he's even more critical of the state and state violence. And that's the thing that he thinks we need to be worried about. And so in terms of his relevance for us today, I think if you take it out of the Christian vocabulary, which it comes with, but I think he means it in a universal sense. You can argue that in the book. It's about stopping any complicity in violence, in any systems of violence, in any, by extension, any systems that are, unjust or that perpetrate violence. And that includes, certainly as a conscript, you reject conscription and that kind of thing. It's a big thing for him, but also the violence that we contribute to as producers of various implements of violence, the violence we might contribute to as consumers that put money into systems that end up feeding systems of violence. I mean, again, that's something I try and unpack a bit in the book, but yeah, so plenty I could unpack, but
yeah, very interesting. I have to be quite honest. I began with Tolstoy, but I'm like, it's difficult for me. Non-scientific publishing books are, I don't know why, but it's hard for me to read. Don't like stories.
But that, yeah, okay. You mean the fictional bits of Tolstoy?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
well, I'll tell you very honestly, it's not the bit I'm interested in. I'm terrible. My wife has a go at me for that. I'm not very good with fiction in general, including theories, etc. I'd rather read about the real world, which is problematic. But anyway, but no, I mean, this is the Tolstoy I got hooked on. The Tolstoy that keeps, appearing in my writing, in my research is the Tolstoy whose writings are explicitly political and kind of religious. And I mean, some of the fiction he writes in his later years, and he writes a bit, is very influenced by his new political and religious outlook. But and I bring that in at times, but it's the more outright kind of political stuff written after 1880 or 79 that I think is most interesting, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Let's jump to our last topic. I'm very curious. You mentioned anarchism is badly or misinterpreted, or maybe it's some sort of propaganda or narrative, false narrative, with the bomb throwing guys, so with violence. It's like synonym to violence and chaos. And there is another one, which me as a political science student working on my PhD, I encounter almost every month in an article or in a paper, in a newspaper, in a TV show. It's horrible. Coming as it's from the international relations perspective, the dominant, or maybe the orthodox view, the mainstream view, the realist approach, they assume that anarchism is a state, how they put it, like a
condition of the international world
yes,
is anarchy,
yes,
right?
Yes,
we live in an anarchic world, which means there's no central government, which is why it's kind of a war of all against all, and therefore we need to arm ourselves against our enemies, etc.
Yeah, that's a completely false interpretation of the status quo in the first place, and then of the use of the term anarchism.
Well, yes. So sat on this very desk a few years ago, marking yet another essay from students who, to be fair, are only doing what we're teaching them to do, which is tell us about realism, liberalism, social constructivism, and fairly classic perspectives on international politics. They get more radical views later in that module, but that's on the curriculum. That's a different debate. I got frustrated and thought there's got to be more out there in terms of anarchist or pacifist, or as I then ended up doing it, kind of an anarcho-pacifist reading of international relations. I tried to frame it as a theory, but it's not enough to call it a theory according to one of the reviewers, so it became a reading of international relations. And I don't know where you want me to go with it. I mean, so that article, which I published fairly recently, argues that there are 5 main arguments that an anarcho-pacifist would make about the international world. One is that there's too much fetishizing of violence. Violence is too often assumed to be effective, etc. There's a whole thread on that, when non-violent methods are potentially just as effective. Another is that the way the world is organized, justified by realist frameworks, even just war theory, etc., makes us end up be on a slide to increasingly systemic militarism, and so it's kind of the war system that it empowers and justifies, which then is something that a lot of politicians feel, you know, willing to mobilize whenever particularly convenient, and so it's kind of self-reinforcing. So there's a whole argument on that. Then there's an argument on some of what we mentioned before, which is that from an anarcho-pacifist perspective, I think you can articulate a criticism of all sorts of exploitation, ultimately underscored by the state. So state-enforced multifaceted exploitation would be the theme, as it were, and how, you know, global capitalist networks of production, all sorts of other forms of hierarchies are ultimately maintained by the Westphalian state. So there's all that. And then to get to, I think what you were driving at partly, there's a range of comments about the way the international order is structured and could be structured. And so for anarchists and anarcho-pacifists, the problem with the international world isn't necessarily specific individuals, but it's the way we structured our relations and what it does to one another. Anarcho-pacifists, anarchists would notice that in the international world, there's lots to look at that isn't necessarily to do with the state, all sorts of allegiances, collectivities, organizations that ultimately often do knock on the doors of states, because states ultimately hold power, have budgets, they can help fund them, whatever, but that make up an interesting and overlapping set of organizations, again, allegiances that help react to things in the world, and they see that as evidence of a kind of an ontological anarchy, as in it's the way things can bubble up quite organically before and separate from the strictures of the Westphalian state that we then nevertheless still impose upon it. And so there's plenty of reflection to be done about the way the international world is organized, the way a lot of conventional theory justifies the Westphalian order, and how we could look at it differently, and how you can look at all sorts of examples today as examples of arranging things differently, which again, I kind of go into a bit in that article from an anarchist or an anarcho-pacifist perspective. So yeah, but that's, of course, it's frustrating that a lot of mainstream theory in IR, international relations, talks of, the international world as anarchic in the sense of chaotic, a war of all against all, which is an interesting, it's obviously not, they don't even claim that it represents how anarchists think about the world, but it does say a lot about what they think the world would look like if there wasn't a central authority, which, by the way, there isn't. But so anyway, I'm getting muddled up, but there's a whole special issue, by the way, I forget the journal, was it Millennium, that looks at the typical conception of anarchy in international relations from a critical perspective, and these are all kind of anarchist scholars or scholars of anarchism who question exactly that. Really interesting work.
Yeah, I personally, I'm very interested in this kind of field and in your research because I believe it's can be very fruitful and very productive for peace studies. Because in my last interview with Professor Oliver Richmond from Manchester University, he talked about local peace formations, and he talked about his 20 years of experience in United Nations peace building, the liberal state building, liberal peace building, and he talked to me very honestly, and he was very disappointed, and he narrowed this peace structure in some sort of it is a power relation to stabilize the status quo, not to change it, just to stabilize it. And then his solution was emancipatory, positive peace, so to speak. And starting with Johann Galtung's positive peace, deconstructing structural violence, and so on and so forth, and listening to the people, to the local voices, to the local needs. And this is also here, I draw some parallels with your research interests. This is the critical security studies. Here one can draw a parallel, and maybe this three critical security studies, peace studies, and anarcho-pacifist perspective of it can be fruitful, it can be productive, yeah, in order to understand the world.
I agree entirely, and so three quick things in response, I suppose. One scholar whose work I find particularly interesting in this territory is Richard Jacques, who of course has written a lot in terrorism studies, critical terrorism studies, but is particularly interested in pacifism and has helped kind of, has published some really useful articles about pacifism in IR and including in peace studies, or certainly in getting the label wrong, but peacekeeping literature as well. So anyway, he's really interesting now. But in terms of, I suppose, my own work and why, not so much to kind of put the spotlight on me, but to tell you why I agree with you. And the two main, I suppose, strands of my research these days are, on the one hand, I want to write a few more anarcho-pacifist commentaries on different things, kind of applying the anarcho-pacifist perspective. So I did it on IR theory. The next one is on the European project and the way Europe has been built, as it were. After that, I'd like to look at the UN, maybe the UN Security Council or collective security, kind of applying precisely, I think, the more critical perspective, the more radical perspective that anarcho-pacifism gives you to some of these different problems. There's probably something in there somewhere on, I could write on the military-industrial complex, perhaps. And by the way, there's also probably a paper looking at the tension between anarchism and pacifism. So there's plenty. That my main research program, as it were, these days is around anarcho-pacifism, precisely because I agree with you, and I think the lens it gives you on interesting kind of on these kinds of problems. But separately, just to give that a plug, I'm also in the process of helping launch a journal, the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence, which will start publishing proper next year. I think March 2023 is when the first issue is expected, more or less. And among the perspectives I'm interested in fostering in that journal are precisely all sorts of applications of kind of more radical pacifist perspectives. This isn't just about pacifism, as in it's not just supposed to be a love fest. We're going to look critically at pacifism as well and nonviolence. And I can't publish my own research in it much, right? Because I'm the editor, so I can't ensure peer review. But I want the journal to be open to more critical voices applying those more, I suppose, that pacifist framework, the adoption of the framework of pacifism and nonviolence to all sorts of questions, including, by the way, in methods of governance too, and how states can adopt policies that are less violent, etc. So, that's just to illustrate how far I'm absolutely willing to go, because I think there's plenty that can be done there too. So I'm agreeing with you, and that's why, and I'm illustrating that by telling you that my research agenda, as it were, is kind of really focused on that increasingly.
That's a wonderful project. Yeah, when do it start?
I mean, we're basically finalizing the first issue as we speak. I got another manuscript in today, like final version. So March 23 is the first issue. So it'll start with 2 issues a year. Moving to more, depending on how much volume we get through. There's a workshop I'm organizing next year as well to try and foster more papers for it, and there's plenty of interest, so it should be an interesting journal, hopefully. So yeah, Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence. Look it up.
Nice. We will of course put the link inside the YouTube box so people can reach out and submit papers and or read it. Just read it.
Yeah.
Just be curious and read it.
Yeah, great.
So I don't have any further question, no more questions. So I thank you very much for this insightful talk, very radical talk.
Thank you, pleasure.
It was very nice.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good questions, and always like to talk about these things. So thanks. I hope it was interesting to whoever's listening.